Good evening. Hope all of you are doing well. Today we are learning Maseches, Yevamos, daf, Lamed Ches, the night of Bdikas Chametz, and we are starting 8 lines down or so on Lamed Ches Amud Aleph. Yesterday we were discussing a continued sugya of the Mishnah that began this parak. The case that we were discussing was where a child was born, and we don't know if he was the child of Reuven, the man who died, or if he was the child of Shimon, who was the Yavam, who actually got married a little too early and was intimate with Rachel after her husband died, but they were intimate during the first 3 months. So then we don't know. The baby's a suffix Tishi'i l'Rishon and a suffix Shvi'i l'Sheni. We just don't know who this child is. So yesterday we discussed how this has an impact on Yerusha. We spoke about 4 or 5 cases, and we're actually going to speak about a few more, and then we're going to get to a new fascinating sugya in the new Mishnah. Let's get started 8 lines down, Lamed Ches Amud Aleph. So another case of Yerusha, Safek, the child who we don't know if he belongs to Reuven or Shimon, V'Yavam, and Shimon himself, Shabau Lachlok B'Nichsei Saba. This is talking about the grandfather of the Safek. So there's 3 generations. We've been speaking about Reuven and Shimon, and our case was that Reuven was married to Rachel and Reuven died, and Rachel fell to Shimon B'Yibum. So now we don't know who this child is. His name is Chaim the Safek, and Chaim's grandfather, who is the father of Reuven and Shimon. Okay, so you've got Yaakov, who's the grandfather. Reuven and Shimon are 2 of his kids. And Chaim the Safek, we don't know who his father is it Reuven or Shimon? All we know right now is Reuven's dead. Chaim the Safek might want to take some money from the grandfather as part of a Yerusha. So that's our case. So it says the Gemara, if it's a Safek v'Yavam shabo lachlok b'nichsei Saba, if you have Chaim the Safek and Shimon, who would like to take Yaakov's money, this is Shimon and Reuven's father, from Yerusha. So Safek Amar, Chaim the Safek will say, Hi Gavra Bar Misnahu, I, speaking about himself, I am the Bar Misna, I'm the son of Reuven. I should be getting 50% of Yaakov's money. Upalga didihu, half of that money belongs to me. And Yavam Amar, Shimon would say, no, at beroe didiat, you are my child, beles lach belomidi, you have absolutely no rights at all. So Shimon gets 100%, and the Safek gets 0%. And says the Gemara, what do we do in such a case? Have a Yavam Vadai, the Safek, the Yavam, Shimon, he definitely gets at least 50%. His overall status is that he is a Vadai recipient on the Yerusha side, because whether or not Reuven is dead or alive doesn't change the fact that Shimon still gets a Yerusha from his father. So he's a Vadai, and Chaim the Safek is 50-50. We don't know if he has rights to anything. The Ein Safek Motzi Midei Vadai, a principle we've seen before and we'll see many times again, including in a minute, where Ein Safek Motzi Midei Vadai, that if we have a Safek, Chaim the Safek, who might be the child of Reuven or Shimon, and we don't know, there's a 50-50 chance that he has any right to Yaakov's money, his grandfather's money. And therefore, because Shimon definitely is a Yoresh, and Chaim the Safek is 50-50, so therefore he gets nothing. What about the next case? Safek ubnei Yavam. So you have Chaim the Safek and Shimon's children. Shabo lachlok b'nichsei Saba. This, as it relates to all of these, are the grandkids of Yaakov. And then Safek Amar Hahu Gavra Bar Misna. He really, he says about himself. Chaim the Safek says, I'm Reuven's child, and I should get 50%. Upalga didihu. And Uvnei Yavam, the children of Shimon, say no. Amri, they said, Achuna at, you're our brother. Uminsa islach behadon. You have a portion of our father's money like anything else. So there's 2 brothers on that side of the family. Plus, they say that their 3rd brother is Chaim the Safek. So then how do we do the math? So palga de kamo dilahu shakli. Everyone agrees that half of the money most definitely goes to the children of Shimon. There's no question about that. That's clear. So that, let's say it's $100, let's say it's $100,000. So $50,000 goes to the children of Shimon. Tilsa de kamodule shakal. Everyone also agrees that worst case scenario, Chaim the Safek is Shimon's child, and he should get 1/3 of the Yerusha, 3 kids on that side. So they give him $30,000. So it says the Gemara, Pashlahu Danka, there's approximately a 6th left. It's not really correct. It should be a 5th left. If you have a half given away, plus you have a 1/3 given away, so that's 83. It's actually exactly right. Then you have 83%. So there's 17% left approximately of the money, and that's approximately 1/6. That's a danka. So then have a mamon hamotel b'safek b'cholkin. That last 1/6 But the way that it works out is that each person gets half. So here's how all the math would work. Let me paint the picture for you. There's a man named Yaakov. He has two sons, Reuven and Shimon. And Shimon has two definite children. And there's a child named Chaim the Suffolk. We don't know if he belongs to Reuven or Shimon. So the two children that belong to Shimon, they for sure get money. They for sure get 50%. There's no question about it. And under the best of circumstances, Chaim the Suffolk gets 50% because he's Reuven's son. Under the worst of circumstances, Reuven gets a third because he might be Shimon's son. So they give him a third as well. And the rest of the money, the 1/6, they split. So that means that the two kids are going to get 50% plus, plus 9%. They'll get approximately 60%. And the rest of the money will go to Shimon. Will go to the Suffolk. So that's what the Gemara says. Last case before we get to the Mishnah. Halfway down on Lamed Ches Amud Aleph, Saba v'Yavam b'nichse Suffolk. Let's say the Suffolk dies, Chaim the Suffolk dies, and his grandfather Yaakov and Shimon, the possible father, they're splitting his money. Oh, Saba v'Suffolk, or the grandfather and Chaim the Suffolk b'nichse Yavam are trying to split the monies of the Yavam of Shimon himself. That too is have maman hamutal b'Suffolk b'cholkin. There is no real clarity there as to what's what. That brings us to a new Mishnah and ends these subtle different cases of Yerusha. And that really does also wrap up this larger conversation that we've been having about if a woman were to get married within the 3 months of becoming a Yevama, where she might be pregnant, and then she does have a kid, and we don't know who the child belongs to. Fine. Next Mishnah, 2/3 of the way down, Lamed Ches Amud Aleph. We've spoken fairly extensively throughout the Masechta about Zika. Zika is a halachic tethering between the birth of, between the death of a woman's husband, where she instantly has some type of bond to Reuven's brother, to Shimon, and that's called Zika. We've discussed Yesh Zika or Ein Zika, and this new Mishnah on Lamed Ches is really very similar to that idea. So here we go, Lamed Ches Amud Aleph, 2/3 of the way down at a brand new Mishnah. Shomeres Yavam. Let's say that there's a woman who just became a Yevama. She is waiting for her Yavam. In other words, she can't get married yet. She has to wait a few months, as we've been discussing in detail. So she's a Shomeres Yavam. She's not yet able to get married. Does she have Zika at this point? Let's see. Says the Gemara, so a Shomeres Yavam, this woman who's awaiting Yibum, Shenaflu La Nechasim, who inherited, won the lottery, whatever it is, she got money of her own. Everyone agrees that this money is exclusively hers. So normally we have a rule that when a woman enters into a marriage contract, so the money is shared. The money really belongs to the husband, whatever the details are. But here, when she is only, quote unquote, a shomeres yavam, she's not engaged halachically. She's not married halachically. She's just a yavama. She's a shomeres yavam. She's awaiting her yibum. The din is that if she's awaiting yibum and she falls into some money, she falls into some property, both Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree that the money is hers. Mesa, if she dies, what happens with her ksuba if she dies? And also, what happens with the nechasim, the property that comes with her in marriage, and that would be what we refer to as nichsei malug, her dowry, whatever money she typically brings to the marriage. So here we have a machlokas. Unlike in the ratio where Beis Shammai and Hillel agree, here they disagree. Beis Shammai omrim that in the case where the woman dies, yachloku yorshe habal im yorshe ha'av. Each side of the family will split some of her Yerusha. Yorshe habal, the family of the husband, will get some. Im yorshe ha'av, and the family, her father, will get some of the money as well, 50-50. Beis Hillel omrim, no, nothing changes from the ratio of the Mishnah. And omrim nechasim b'chezkasam. Everything stands where they were initially. Ksuva b'chezkas yorshe habal. The money of the ksuba stays with the husband's family, and nichasim hanichnasim yotzim yima b'chezkas yorshe ha'av. And the property that belongs to her, the nichsei malug, the property that she brings into the marriage, that stays with her family. So the Gemara is going to be bothered by the fact that nothing really transpired between the Reish and Seif of the Mishnah other than her dying. So why is it that Beis Shammai only argued in one case and not the other? That will take up most of today's conversation. But let's first finish this Mishnah with a final case. 5-6 lines from the bottom. Kansa, what if they got married? What if a Shomeres Yavam actually got married? Then Harehi ki ishto l'chol davar. Then they are halachically fully married, unequivocally, ubilvad shetek suvasa al nichsei bail harishon, provided that the ksuva should be on the property of her first husband. That's a din we'll discuss, but not a din that we're going to discuss today. So we'll leave this line a little unclear, and we'll come back to it when the time is right. 4 lines from the bottom, on Lamed Ches Amud Aleph, the Gemara is quite bothered by the following. Maishna Reisha de lo pliki. Why is it that in the beginning of the Mishnah, in a regular case of Shomeres Yavam, in the first 3 months after Ruvain died, Rachel's a Shomeres Yavam, there we said that if she falls into some money, all the property is hers. Why is it that over there, de lo pligi, that Beis Shammai said nothing? Umaishna Seifa de pali. And why in the Seifa, all of a sudden, with her death, does Beis Shammai say Yachloku? Why does he pivot? Why does he change his shita? So we're going to see a number of answers to this question. We'll see 2 today, and that will bring us to the end of the day. And then starting tomorrow, we'll see answers 3 and 4. Here is answer number 1 to our question. Omar Ula says, Reisha, in the initial case where the Mishnah refers to this woman simply as a Shomeres Yavam, she's Rachel. Rachel is awaiting marrying Shimon. So in the Reisha, Dinafla Kshehi Arusa. When she became a Yevama, she was only betrothed to Ruvain. So she had gotten engaged to Ruvain, and then Ruvain died, and now she's a Shomeres Yavam. She was not fully married prior to her husband's death. She was only halachically engaged prior to her husband's death. The Seifa, the second case of the Mishnah, where the Shomeres Yavam dies, where Rachel dies, says the Gemara, that's the Naflak Shehi Nesua. That case was talking about where her previous marriage to Ruvain, before he died, they were fully married. And there was, not only was there a Kiddushin, not only was there Erusin, but there was also Chuppah, there was also Nisun, they're fully married. And then the Gemara explains, the Kasavar, and when we say that a woman was betrothed and then became a Yevama, let's see what the Gemara says. Because Savar, Ula holds, last line of Lamed Ches Amud Aleph, Zikas Arusa, when a woman becomes a Shomeres Yavam after having been only engaged, then Ose Safek Arusa, that makes her into a Safek Arusa. We'll see the implications of this momentarily. Top of Lamed Ches Amud Aleph. And Zikas Nesua, if a woman was initially fully married to Ruvain, both Be'erusin and Benisuin, and then she becomes a Shomeres Yavam with Ruvain's death, that is Osei Safek Nesua. That's a Safek Nesua. And it doesn't mean she's in her previous marriage, she was X, and in this new Shomeres Yavam status, she's Safek of X. And how does this play out? Zika Sarusa Osa Safek Harusa. If Rachel was only halachically engaged to Ruvain when Ruvain died, we know that our Mishnah is discussing the case of Safek Harusa. How do we know that? Because the Isal Kadaitach Vaday Arusa, had it been that in our Mishnah in the Reisha, we were talking about a case where Rachel was actually treated fully as a betrothed woman and not a suffix of a betrothed woman, then Modim Beis Hillel Shemocheres V'Nosenes V'Kayam. How then could Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel agree? And most pointedly, how can Beis Hillel even say that the money is all hers? That's not true. Beis Hillel explicitly says that if a woman is fully engaged, if she's an Arusa Mamish, then under those circumstances, the money is not perfectly hers. Where do we see that? The Mishnah writes, Naflu la nechasim mishenis arsa. If a woman is engaged, she's properly halachically engaged, not a suffix, she's mamish engaged, and then she inherits a lot of product. She inherits a field, money, whatever it is. Beis Shammai omrim timkor, she is allowed to sell. Ubeis Hillel omrim lo timkor. What does Beis Hillel say when a woman is engaged? She's not allowed to sell that property because her husband now has his hands on that property because she's fully engaged. Therefore, our Mishnah, by definition, must be a case where it's not an Arusa, and therefore it makes sense, like Ula's first answer, which is to say that our Mishnah is talking about a Safek Arusa. Let's finish this brisa. Elu ve'elu modim she'em machra v'nosna kayim. But they both agree that if in fact she did try to sell, the kinyan does actually take effect, and it would be considered sold. And therefore, we see from here that Beis Hillel holds clearly that if a woman is naflu la nechasim mishenis arsa, if she's fully engaged and she's not a suffix arusa, so then if she's a suffix arusa, so then our Mishnah makes sense, and it has to be over here that we're talking about an arusa mamish. Shma mina zikas arusa osa suffix arusa. So that explains the reisha of our Mishnah. Let's review. Ula was answering the following question: why is it that in the reisha, when a woman is considered a shomeres yavam, If a woman is considered a shomeres yavam, there we said that she is a full owner of her own property. Yet in the Seifa, when it says Mesa, all of a sudden Beis Shammai kicks up some sand and says, hey, no, that doesn't work, yachloku. Why the difference? So Ula says the Reisha and Seifa are talking about two different things. The Reisha is discussing a case where we are dealing with a Safek Arusa. What about the second part of the Mishnah, the Seifa, the case where the Shomeres Yavam dies? So 8 lines down on Lamed Ches Amud Beis, the Gemara says, Zikas Nesua Osa Safek Nesua. How do we know that it's true? That if Rachel had been fully married to Ruvain before Ruvain died, and now she's nofeles b'yibum to Shimon as a full Nesua, now, how do we know that she's treated as a Safek Nesua in her Shomeres Yavam status? Says the Gemara, it has to be that way. If you want to say that our Mishnah is discussing a case where she's fully married, that can't be, because in our Mishnah it says, Beis Shammai omrim yachloku yorshe habal im yorshe ha'av. He says that there is a yachloku, that we split in regards to the Yorshe Habal, to his side of the family, in Yorshe Ha'av, and her side of the family. But that's not true, because V'hatnan, the Mishnah writes, if in fact she fell into some money or some property after she was fully married, she cannot make any of those fiscal decisions on her own. Her husband has a strong hand in it. It's not even a kinyan anymore. We can totally retract. So therefore, our Mishnah cannot be talking about a case where Rachel was fully married to Shimon, fully married to Ruvain, and then Ruvain died, and she fell to Shimon as a Nesua Mamish. It has to only be a Safek, Yelashma Mina, Zikas Nesua, Ose Safek Nesua. That had it been that Rachel was fully married to Ruvain, and then Ruvain died, and then she becomes a Shomeres Yavam to Shimon. So that means that the only way that this fits with all of the Mari Mekomos is if we assume that her status is as a Safek Nesua and not as a Nesua Vadai. But the Gemara is bothered by this because of a side reason. Amar le Rabba, ademiflagi begufa ula achar misa. If what we're talking about is property that belongs to her, the gufa, the principle of the property, if we're discussing that and after her death, why don't we discuss a more normative case? Liflagu bechayeha ula peros. We should have simply made a distinction between the principle and the peros, as opposed to saying her being alive and her being dead. Various comments on this in the Rishonim, but the Gemara is bothered by the fact that our Mishnah chose the contrast cases of living and dead instead of the cases of Keren and Peros. So the Gemara says, because of that, we flip to answer number 2. What are we answering again? We're answering, why is it the Beis Shammai in the Reisha was of the opinion that a woman who's a Shomeres Yavam has full rights to her property, whereas when in the Seifa, when it says that she's a Mesa, that it's Yachloku. And the Gemara here provides its second answer, 1/3 of the way down in Lamed Ches Amud Beis, in the name of Rabba. Ela Amar Rabba, Rabba says, Idi v'idi dinaflak shinasua. Both cases, the case where the Mishnah simply refers to as a Shomeres Yavam, and the case where she's a Mesa, both of those cases is where she was fully married to Ruvain prior to Ruvain's death. The Zikas Nesua, Ose Safek Nesua, and like we said in the first answer of Ula, that the Zikas Nesua, that the bond of a Nesua in her initial marriage to Ruvain leaves her in a case of Shomeres Yavam as a Safek Nesua. And if that's true, how then do we distinguish between the Reisha and the Seifa? The Reisha, which is the case of a classical Shomeres Yavam, and the Seifa is a case where the Shomeres Yavam dies. So it says the Gemara, Reisha de'ihi kaima, in the Reisha where the Shomeres Yavam is still alive, so then Havala ihi vadai v'inhu Safek. Then the way that Rabbah structures his answer is that the mechanics are different in each case. When we say that she's alive, then because she's alive, she's a vadai as it relates to having a connection to her money, the inhu Safek, but everybody else has a status of Safek because her whole status is Safek Nesua. So her husband is only a Safek as to whether or not there's any rights to that money. Ve'ein Safek motze midei vadai. However, Seifa de Mesa, in the second case of the Mishnah, where we said that the Shomeres Yavam had died, halalu ba'in lirash v'halalu ba'in lirash v'yachloku. The cases are different. The elements of Safek are different. Safek and Vadai are different. So therefore, that's how Rabbah answers our question. Rabbah says that the Reish of our Mishnah is talking about a fully married woman, but it's a Safek versus a Vadai, and ain't Safek motzi midei Vadai. And the second case of the Mishnah, the case of Mesa, is where everybody's a Safek, and therefore yachloku. Very clean answer. The Gemara is going to ask a couple of questions, and this will actually leave us with somewhat of a rejection of answer number 2, and then we'll stop 2 lines from the bottom with Amar Abaye, but let's first get there. Eisve Abaye, halfway down, 4 lines before the wide lines on Lamed Ches Amud Beis. Abaye has a problem. See, because what we just learned implied that Ule Beis Shammai ein safek motzi midei vadai. It seems to be that Abaye learned Beis Shammai to understand from our Mishnah that Beis Shammai holds that ein safek motzi midei vadai. But that doesn't seem to necessarily be true about Beis Shammai, because v'hatnan nafal habayis alav ve'al aviv. If a house falls on a man and on his father, alav ve'al morishab, or it falls on a man and his inheritors. V'hayu alav ksuba isha ubalchov. He had some ksuvas isha ubalchov. He had some burdens on him, not necessarily both, but he had some type of financial burden on him when he died, but he had no money to pay it out. So everyone's going to argue about who died first to their own benefit. Says the Gemara, Yorshei ha'av, the people who are the inheritors of the inheritors of the father, Omrim, no, haben meis rishon ve'achar kach meis ha'av. The first burden falls on the son, and it's not on me. Ubal chov omer ha'av meis rishon ve'achar kach meis haben. And the Baal Chov wants his money, so he argues a little differently. And in the second of the Y lines, what's the din in such a case? Beis Shammai omrim yachloku, ubeis Hillel omrim nechasim b'chez kasan. Beis Shammai says we split in such a case when we don't know who died first. And Beis Hillel says, no, everything stands in its own chazaka. What's the analysis of this brisa, of this Mishnah? Says the Gemara, v'hahacha, Yorshei ha'av is a vadai, and Baal Chov is a suffix. The reason he's a Baal Chov is not, the reason he's a suffix is because of a principle we're going to learn about at a later point, which is referred to as mechusar gubaina, because it's not such an easy thing to collect money when you're a Baal Chov. You have to do all the paperwork. You have to make sure you're communicating clearly. So even though you may well have rights to the money, but it's a whole big process. So we treat you like a suffix. Yet what do we see in this case? V'ka'asi suffix umotzi midei vadai. So how can it be in our Mishnah? Asks Abaye. How can it be in our Mishnah that Beis Shammai seems to be of the opinion of ein suffix motzi midei vadai, when this Mishnah about the house falling on a person and his father, there it's suffix motzi midei vadai. So answers the Gemara, it's not true. Really, Beis Shammai is of the opinion of ein suffix motzi midei vadai. But here, it's not a case of a suffix. It's not suffix and vadai in this case, because really the Baal Chov, who we said is mechusar gubaina, it may be true that we hold that he's mechusar gubaina. However, kasari Beis Shammai, they have a unique shita. They hold that shtar ha'omed legabos kegavui dami. Wow. If you have an unpaid invoice, we treat it as though it's a vadai, even though it's true that he's mechusar gubaina. Very unique shita. So that's how the Gemara gets out of this little pickle. It says that you thought that really in our Mishnah that Beis Shammai was of the opinion of ein suffix motzi midei vadai. You're right. He does hold the ein suffix motzi midei vadai. What about the case where we don't know who died first, where the building collapsed? You're right, but there it's for a secondary reason that Beis Shammai seems to say suffix motzi midei vadai, because it's not a suffix. It's rather because shtar ha'omed legabos kegavui dami. So says the Gemara, uminat timra. How do I know that I'm supposed to explain the shita of Beis Shammai this way? So says the Gemara, ditznan, because we have a Mishnah. Mesu b'haleyanad shelo shasu. This is talking about a case of sota. Let's say that there's a woman who is about to drink the mei sota and her husband dies on the spot, as if it wasn't dramatic enough. We're relying on a nes nigla about sota to see what the story is with this woman, if she was mezana or not. The husband dies standing right there. So says the Gemara, what do we do? The Mishnah answers, Beis Shammai omrim not los ksuvasan ve'enan shosos. She can take the money from the ksuba and from the yorshim, from the Baal, ve'enan shosos, and of course they don't drink the mei sota. Ubeis Hillel omrim, that's not right. O shosos, Olo notlos ksuvasan. Either they have to drink or they don't take the ksuva money. Says the Gemara, does Beis Hillel really mean they should drink the mei sota? O shosos, that can't be. Why can't it be that Beis Hillel means that they're supposed to drink the mei sota? Because 3/4 of the way down, the Gemara says, Vehevi ha'ishes ishto amarachmana veleka. It has to be that a man is bringing this woman to task on her behavior, and there is no man anymore. So the line in the sand is that if the man dies before the shasias mei sota, she no longer drinks it. Veleka, he's not even present anymore. Says the Gemara, of course, that's what we mean. Ella, mitoch shelo shosos lo notlos ksubasa. No, because they didn't have a chance to verify whether or not they were innocent. Therefore, they don't collect a ksuba. What do we see from here? We don't know if she was a cheater or not, because she has a suffix and she still doesn't collect the ksuba. And the ksuba was a vadai status, so we see suffix is motzi midei vadai. So therefore, therefore we see that really Beis Shammai should be of that opinion. So Ella, that's a problem because that seems to be the opposite of what we said. Ella Shma Mina. Therefore we see it must be that Ishtar ha'omed legabo says kegavui dami. Fine. Says the Gemara ve'Abaye. I don't understand. When Abaye posed his question 4 lines before the wide lines, what case did he ask about? He asked about the case of Nafal Habayis Allah ve'al aviv. So says the Gemara ve'Abaye. Why didn't you ask from this newer case, Lo Sve Meha? Why didn't you ask from the case of Sota? Why did you ask from the case of the building collapsing? Says the Gemara, we can't ask from that case of Sota because Dilma Ksuvas Isha shiny mishum china. There's something unique about a Ksuvas Isha that there was some chain put into it. What does that mean? So the Hagos V'Tzionim here in Os Katan Aleph writes, Perush, what does it mean that there's china? De Kevan Sheyodas. She'afilu misafek no telas ksuvasa mishameshes labayla v'yalas chen beinei bayla. She's going to try harder in her marriage because she knows that even if there's some element of safek, then she could lose her own ksuba. So you can't bring a raya one way or the other from a case of a ksuba mishum china. Says the Gemara. Well, what about the fact that our Mishnah speaks about ksuba? Our Mishnah, the one on the previous page that we learned about 15 minutes ago on Lamed Ches Amud Aleph, says the Gemara. Why don't you learn from our Mishnah? What about our Mishnah? Says the Gemara, lo pligi, because Beis Shammai doesn't argue in that case of ksuba in our Mishnah. Says the Gemara, velo, does he not? Vaktani. What does our Mishnah say? Our Mishnah on Lamed Ches Amud Aleph quoted here, Mesa, if she dies, ma ya'aseh biksuvasa. What do we do with her ksuva? And as well, uvenechasim hanichnasim liyotzim ima. And what about the properties that she brings into her marriage, aka nechsei malub? And what did we say there? The Beis Shammai omrim yachloku yorshei habalim yorshei ha'av ubeis Hillel omrim nechasim b'chezkasan. There, in regards to the case of the ksuba and the case of nechsei malub, what did Beis Shammai say? He said, Yachloku, Yorshei Abalim, Yorshei Av. The father's side, the mother's side, they each split the money. And Beis Hillel said everything stays status quo. But what we see from here is that Beis Shammai does seem to argue about the ksuba. Says the Gemara, you need to read the Mishnah more carefully. Hachi Kamar, 5 lines from the bottom. If you look back at our Mishnah, you'll see that when it says the words Mesa, Ma Yasa Biksuvasa, really the Mishnah doesn't provide an answer. Vishavka. Nobody spoke about an answer to the case of ksuba mentioned in our Mishnah. It says, Nechasim hanichnasim v'hayotzim ima. There, when we speak about the properties she brings into her marriage, about the nichsei malub, there we see Beis Shammai, omrim yachloku, yorshei habalim, yorshei ha'av, and Beis Hillel omrim nechasim b'chezkasim. But our Mishnah doesn't have a case, doesn't have an answer to the discussion about a woman's ksuba in our Mishnah on Lamed Ches Amud Aleph. And therefore, says the Gemara, and we'll close with this line, Amar Rav Ashi, Masnisim Nami Deka. That's actually implied quite subtly in the line of Beis Shammai. Diktani Yachloku. Beis Shammai said that in regards to the case of the Nichsei Malug, that they should split. How do they split? Yorshei HaBaal im Yorshei Ha'av. The Yorshei HaBaal really are secondary im Yorshei Ha'av. They're splitting with the primary holders of the Yorshei Ha'av, and we see from here that we're not focusing on the Ksuba, we're focusing on that which comes from the Nichsei Malug, that which comes from her father, the Yorshei Ha'av, the Loktani Yoresh Ha'av, im Yoresh Ha'bal, Shmamina. It wasn't written in the reverse way, where the Yorshei Ha'av or her family is taking from his. Shmamina, that is the conclusion over here, that we have now wrapped up this little answer number 2, but we'll see tomorrow that there's going to be a third answer and even a fourth as to why it is that in our Mishnah, in the Reisha Beis Shammai doesn't argue, and in the Seifa he does. Wishing you all a beautiful night.
Who hasn't